Welcome to the Demi Taste podcast. I am your host, Demi Taste. Um, wow, I just like completely spaced on the whole introduction. Yeah. Welcome to the Demi Taste podcast, where we do a little bit of tasting and a lot of talking. Mostly we talk about whiskey, but the great thing about whiskey is the conversations that we get to have. And on this podcast, we get to talking about a little bit of everything. So today, our topic is not whiskey at all. In fact, we have as our special guest today Seth O'Malley of Wilderton Non-Alcoholic Spirits. And he's going to talk to us about the process of producing spirits which are non-alcoholic and which are designed to be excellent spirits in their own right. That's probably editorializing way too much. Seth, how are you?
I'm great, Doug. It's really fun to be on the show. Thank you.
So I have so many questions, and I'm glad that we got to meet up pretty close to the originally scheduled thing. Last week we did our episode on dry week non-alcoholic cocktails featuring your ingredients, which was kind of our original plan. So maybe today we don't get so much into the building of the cocktails and the ingredients, but focus way more on like how they're made and what the philosophy is that goes into them. So I've buried the lead, I guess, that these are non-alcoholic spirits. I've tried them all, so I have my own take on them. But before I spoil it for everyone, let me just ask you, um, what is the how did this all come about, and maybe how do you make these? That's way
Yeah,
too broad
sure.
of a question.
We'll start with the beginning. I was born in Salem, Oregon. No, I, well, we'll go back pretty far. So for about as long as I can remember, I have been enchanted with herbs and spices. Some of my earliest kind of olfactory memories are pulling off jars of spice lids in my parents' kind of stale spice collection, and just being really kind of amazed by these flavors. And I learned that they just came from plants that had been dehydrated and maybe ground down to a powder or something. And I just thought that was cool. I think that we take I won't speak in too broad strokes, but people tend to take spices for granted. But there was a time when spices were luxury items, and for me, I just feel so lucky to be able to have a jar full of nutmeg, which at some point would have cost tens of thousands of dollars. It's just this really special thing, and for me, it's always been about just the sensory experiences that they can bring about. That turned into an interest in tea. Tea, is another plant that humans consume for the sake of taste. It also has wonderful post-ingestive effects that we all know, of caffeine and theanine, and ended up going really deep into tea as a teenager, actually a very weird teenager, if that's not clear already, and ended up at the age of, I think, 16, I started teaching tea classes in my in this tea shop in my hometown that I really fell in love with. While I was doing that, I got to know the owner really well. That just blossomed into this beautiful sort of obsession with tea, and a close personal relationship with the owner. His name was Matt Thomas, and he had created Townsend's Tea House, and that eventually gave way to Brew Doctor Kombucha. He invited me in. Dates aren't important, but anyway, he went on
that's
to
that's
invite me.
so funny because I've got
Oh,
one of those right here.
hey, look at that! Yeah. So he had this little tea shop, and quickly after starting Brew Doctor just out of the basement of one of the tea shops, that became the focus of the business because it took off like wildfire, and that's been a very, very successful business. But in oh, now I'm bringing up dates again. In, I want to say, around 2013, there was the whole Lindsay Lohan scandal that some viewers may remember, where Lindsay Lohan was on house arrest and she was subject to these regular breathalyzer tests. And I'm going somewhere with this, I promise. And she had been she blew over 0.08, and so they said, okay, Lindsay, you're not supposed to be drinking, what's the deal? And she said, well, actually, I was just drinking kombucha. um, We don't know. I don't know if anyone independently verified the veracity of Lindsay's claim in that case, but it did invite all of this scrutiny into like what exactly is the alcohol content of kombucha. Um, anyway, the kombucha companies were all kind of scrambling to figure out a solution to remove the alcohol from the kombucha, and Matt's idea was a very good one, I thought, which is just to remove the alcohol through distillation, but with the catch that if you distill kombucha, obviously you're going to pasteurize it in the process unless you do something to reduce the temperature. In our case, he decided that he would invest in a vacuum still so that he could
Mhm.
distill at low temperature, remove the alcohol from the kombucha, and sell a proper traditional kombucha that just had this kind of technologically enhanced step of alcohol removal. It's still fermented and everything. He invited me to be the person who removed the alcohol from the kombucha, and as a second sort of assignment to figure out how to make a craft spirits line of botanical spirits from the dealcoholized kombucha, from the distillate that resulted from that process. So there I was at the age of 23 with a degree in linguistics and no formal spirits education, but I was a big spirits fan. And particularly in line with sort of my lifelong interest in botanicals and herbs and spices, I was very interested in botanical spirits. At the age of 19, I solicited a friend to buy me, I think, my second bottle of alcohol ever, and that was a Linea Aquavit. I just always thought Aquavit was super cool, but that was just part of this kind of budding obsession with Benedictine, with Jägermeister, even Zwack, all of these things I just thought were so cool, but none sort of captivated me like chartreuse. That's the ultimate spirit in my opinion, and something that has just kind of been a constant source of inspiration. So working at what would then become Townsend's Distillery, I got to cut my teeth in kind of dabbling in all of these different spirit categories, figuring out, how do you make how do you make a Fernet? How do you make an Amaro? How do you make something that kind of reminds you of Bekarovka? Warming Christmas, type spices. How do you make absinthe? And I during that time, I spent a lot of time collecting botanicals. I actually took a list of all of the FDA and another agencies list of basically all of the natural flavor ingredients that come from plants that are permitted for use in food. And I started collecting them. I started systematically analyzing them, extracting them in water, extracting them in alcohol. And I built this big library. As far as my professional output at the time, I created a line of craft spirits. I made an aquavit. Well, I didn't market it. I made an aquavit. I made an absinthe. I made what I called an American Genepi, which is based around a wormwood relative that's native to where I live near Portland, Oregon. And I had a lot of fun, and I did a lot of research into the traditions behind these, and read old manuscripts, and hacked my way through some Italian and carried out some recipes. But mostly what I had was this eternal fountain of free alcohol from the kombucha dealcoholization, so I could just iterate, and kind of with impunity, because the alcohol was free. And so I just made batch after batch after batch, and relentlessly revised and changed, and really just kind of let my senses guide me through that process. So I've collected plenty of formal knowledge throughout the process, but the botanical corner of the spirits world, the dusty shelf at the liquor store, is kind of the most arcane. And in my opinion, the best way to get into it is just by trialing over and over, and by being critical about what's coming out of the process, and adjusting accordingly. An advantage that a botanical spirits producer has, as opposed to a whiskey producer, is that there is a relatively close relationship between what you put into the process and what comes out the other side. If there's a rose flavor, it's not because of some complex interaction of esterification or polyphenols or something that was created during a biological process. It is because you put roses in it and you extracted rose flavor from it. right? So the whole category really lends itself to trialing. I will get to where I am now. I realize I'm just kind of on a tangent here, but that's my background. It was the tea on the one hand, botanical spirits on the other. I really love cooking. I love cooking with lots of spices. The culinary traditions that involve lots of spices and herbs are the most exciting to me personally. And while I was working at Townsend's Distillery, as it was called, I came into contact with Brad Whiting, who was at the time working managing Clear Creek, and also worked with Hood River Distillers, which is the largest distillery in Oregon. He had a lot of experience on the business side, let's say, of like spirit sourcing. He had gone to sourcing trips in Tequila, Mexico to buy tequila, to the Republic of Ireland to source Irish cream, and he was just infatuated with it all, but not so much from the lens of production, which wasn't what he did. So he had this idea. He was thinking at this time in his life, he wanted to stay in the spirits world, but he had become a little bit exhausted by what I will call this sort of implicit expectation that if you're in spirits, you're drinking all the time. Obviously, one can have their own boundaries, and that's not necessarily the case for everyone, but there's just a lot of ambient alcohol consumption. And Brad had decided that he wanted to have his cake and eat it too. He wanted to stay connected to the craft of distillation and to the spirits business, broadly interpreted, but he also wanted not to be drinking as much. And so he knocked on my door at the distillery after going to other distillers in town. Most people, I think, were pretty uninterested in the proposition because a lot of distillers, identify strongly with the alcohol part of it and with the sort of the system of distillation as it relates to alcohol. That's fine. I don't begrudge anyone for that. But for me, alcohol, just like water, when I've been working in tea and leading my tea classes and all of this, it's just a means of conveying botanical flavors. That's the way that I think of it. There's more to it than that, but that's been kind of the excitement for me, is the solvent properties of alcohol and how that can be used to extract flavors and aromas from plants. So when he brought it up to me, I thought, oh, okay, well, this is kind of like everything coming full circle. On the one hand, I'm drawing from my tea experience. I know what botanicals are well suited to water, but I'm also using distillation to concentrate what I'm extracting with water. So that would eventually become Wilderton, which is what I'm doing now. And Townsend's unfortunately closed because the board of directors decided that the successful kombucha company was more important than the unsuccessful kombucha-derived Fernet company. And it made a great opportunity for me to jump ship and join Wilderton full-time. And so here I am now. You asked about how, sort of the inception of Wilderton and how it came to be. So I'll get a little bit more specific about the way that we've decided to approach it.
Yep. Before we get into that,
Yes.
I just want to bring Phil into the call. So real quick, I'm going to rearrange the screen just a little bit. Phil, are you ready to come on? Give me a high sign. Cool. Hello, Phil.
Hey, Phil.
I apologize for my tardiness.
If you could turn up the gain on your mic just a little bit. Do just a touch
How are
of
we now?
sound check live. Yeah, good. Yeah, so you heard most of that, I think. I just was
Yes.
waiting for a good time to bring you on. And so Seth, meet Phil. Phil is my co-host.
Hello.
Hey, Phil.
He's really good for keeping me on track and asking good questions. So
Good.
let me rearrange the screen once again, give you back the spotlight, Seth. So you were just about to talk a bit more about the inception.
Yes. So we were, initially experiencing this kind of tension between, okay, well, we want to create things that we believe deserve to be called spirits. We want to bring a craft approach to this. That was the goal from day one. And I'm a little bit of an intentional Luddite. I think that old ways of doing things deserve to be seriously considered and considered on their merits. And if there's a new way to do it that's better, maybe that's the right way to do it. But I was always very connected to, if I'm going to say that this, my botanical spirits contain these ingredients, I'm going to be the one getting as close to those ingredients as possible. I'm bringing in agricultural material. A distillery really is a place where agricultural raw inputs, raw interpreted broadly, are transformed into something that is kind of an abstraction and a curation of the properties of those ingredients under the hands of a distiller and cellar personnel and all these important people that make it work. So we decided, okay, we want to actually be carrying out that transformation in house. We know that distillation ought to play an important role, and our first two spirits are basically entirely distilled, and we would derive inspiration from, and we would nod to spirits traditions, alcoholic spirits traditions that exist, but keep a respectful distance. So and then I also had my my permanent disposition, which is that they were going to be botanical in nature, and I knew that there was a way to sort of crack the code, make something that was interesting, unusual, its own thing, while also feeling like a spirit and solving the really important problem of all these people who are drinking less or coming to a bar and saying, I want a really interesting cocktail, but make it non-alcoholic. I wanted to make something that could go on the back bar, that belonged on the back bar, that deserved to be on the back bar, that had a concentration of flavors, that had a depth and complexity, that earned it a place on the back bar. So that, and importantly, I wanted buy-in from bartenders to see that opportunity. And really, I was hoping to make their lives a little bit easier so that they weren't spending so much time with sous vides and rotovapes trying to make these complex things themselves. So that eventually that became Earthen and Luster, and then more recently the Bittersweet Aperitivo, which admittedly is a little bit closer to this kind of analog world of looking and having concrete things in common with an alcoholic spirits category.
Indeed. I would love to talk more about like the actual construction of each of these spirits that we have. So you sent me and Phil and Ian, who unfortunately hasn't been able to join us, a tasting pack of 3 spirits, which I probably don't have these in the right order anymore. But one of them is Luster. The second was Earthen, and the third was Bittersweet Aperitivo, I believe.
Mm-hmm.
Might as well put my thumb on the scale and say that Luster is my favorite of these.
Oh, really?
I think
Cool.
somehow it's come out to be both the most versatile and the most unique. That like it really feels, as you were saying, that respectful distance from what is, it's not trying to be a pale imitation of another spirit. It really is its own thing, and it functions really well as a substitute for the flavor of multiple different things. I'd say it works as vodka, or it works in vodka recipes, most of them, at least that I've tried. It works in gin recipes. It works in tequila recipes. So I guess like any spirit where you can kind of substitute any cocktail recipe where you can substitute your spirit for something else and sort of modify the recipe or modify the flavor profile without changing too much about the recipe, it works really well for that. So
Well, thank you.
I really like that one. I think that the recipe cards really highlight that really well. So the first one, the Luster and Tonic, I thought was really good. I think so when I got all of these, and it was long enough ago, I'm trying to remember. It was November, I think. And I tried the Earthen and Ginger Ale, the Bittersweet Aperitivo and Soda, and the Luster and Tonic. And out of those, the Luster and Tonic was my favorite for sure. And I liked that I could just pick up an ingredient that I already had and combine it with this and really get a sense for how it functions.
Mm-hmm.
And it does. I've ended up collecting opinions about these from a lot of different places at this point. So one person who sort of weighed in on this for me was Joe O'Sullivan. told me that in addition to all of those things that I had mentioned, one of the things that he really likes about these spirits is that they have the mouthfeel of a real spirit instead of tasting like instead of being sort of slick or watery or something. They have the right viscosity and they have this sort of um, like the bite to them, which is clearly not coming from alcohol, but in a drink that functions a little better by having the bitterness and the bite of the alcohol come through, they do a good job, especially Luster does a good job of replicating that effect.
Oh, well, thank you. That's a nice thing to say, and that's nice of Joe to say. I mean, I adore Joe and I'm so impressed with everything that he makes. Yeah, and you know, alcohol is not, or water is not alcohol. They just have a lot of key differences. It's been interesting being put in a position where have had to think about that really analytically because we all know intuitively what that difference is. But we had to decide kind of early on, you know, how much are we trying to just own, you know, our use of materials, and the main thing really being water affecting the palate versus, you know, trying to go really far to modify the palate and make it taste like something that maybe is alcoholic or just has these other forms of intensity. And I think what you see with a lot of non-alc spirits is that they, you know, there's a lot of reliance on gums. You said kind of slick. I would say that that's probably coming from using something like xanthan gum or gum arabic. I was intentionally a little bit minimal about that, but what I did do was use some botanical extracts, notably like licorice root, which imparts just a little bit of sweetness. That heat comes from an extract of basically cayenne peppers, and then we use Szechuan pepper for a little bit of sort of piquancy. But it's subtle, you know. And I think side by side, a lot of people will notice, oh well, this this doesn't totally feel like alcohol on the palate, and that's fine. That's I think, I guess, inevitable. But in a cocktail is really, you know, the way that we're thinking about, you know, appreciating these and using these. So tasting them is by themselves, it's academic and it's useful. But the real opportunity that we see is in cocktails rather than, you know, out of a Glencairn.
So I just mixed up my favorite of the cocktails that I've tried so far. I've tried 3 from every one of these spirits, I believe. And the one that I liked the most so far was the Luster Margarita.
Oh, cool.
I think that just really has a something special to it. That just, again, you know, I've been talking about how much I like Luster and how it functions. And like in this case, it's substituting for tequila, which I think on its merits, like tasting it neat and knowing what that tastes like, I would not have pegged it as a good tequila substitute, but it works really well in certain tequila drinks. So like a tequila sunrise came out really well for me, using Luster instead. And I ended up with something, I guess I'll go look up my notes and share with you later, but I put a few things on Instagram. But this one in particular, just the right balance of those sorts of like the spiciness and the like the other flavors and that texture that's to it, and adding in that citrus and the sweetness. It's just, there's really something nice for me about this one. Probably my favorite. I think sometimes you meet a cocktail that makes you love the bottle, and like I already loved the bottle. I was like, my wife likes this. She doesn't drink. My wife likes this. I like this. I would replace the bottle even just knowing what it tastes like neat. But then I've discovered a cocktail or two made with this that is making me, you know, I've had to really control myself because I'm down to like the last quarter of this bottle at this point. I wanted to make sure that I still had some when we got our chance to talk. But I'm going to run out of this real soon. And if I wasn't stopping myself from using it all up, I would have used it all up already. And this is definitely something that I would buy another bottle of.
Oh,
So
that's great to hear. So
I get
let me
self-conscious
have it.
because
What
I'm
do you think
basically
of the
just
others?
praising your stuff.
I want to give you an opening to
Yeah.
to
Yeah. That's,
tell
oh,
me
that's a
about
good
tell me
question.
about the other two.
Yeah, that's a good question. So, like, this is not a case of I like this one and I don't like the others. It's more like I like this one so much I can't stop talking about it. The other ones are interesting too. I think that, like, as you said, the bittersweet aperitivo gets really close to like an Amaro or a Campari. I find it bracingly bitter. So like it's not that it's I actually really like it. I like it neat, funny enough, even though it is so intense. Or maybe because it is so intense, I really like it neat. With soda, I felt that the bitterness of the carbon dioxide combined with the bitterness of that
Hmm.
made it just a little too much. I preferred it in other drinks. So I can't remember what else I made with it off the top of my head, but I found a couple of things that worked for me with it. And in general, I think all the recipes work for me with maybe half the amount of the bittersweet aperitivo as what was quoted because it's so intense along those lines. But
Yeah.
that one is for sure my second favorite, and it's really obvious where it's going to fit because it's an obvious substitute for those bitter aperitivos. Um, I don't know that it necessarily has like it doesn't call out as like put me in something else necessarily, but I have dabbled with using it in replacement for like um, Angostura bitters because I think that so like make an old fashioned with earthen and a little splash of bittersweet aperitivo, and like it's not the same, but it's going in an interesting direction. I think with the right syrups and so on, that could really work. With the right garnishes, that could really work. Now earthen, I think I didn't really latch on to earthen right away, but you can also see this one is down to its last quarter, so I figured it out at some point. Uh, the the one that I liked most, I think the one I made most was which was it? Mostly I stuck to the cards. Which one was it? Oh, wrong card. I made the earthen agua fresca. Um, I made that the most times because I did find it really refreshing. So I made the hibiscus tea. I added some earthen to it, some lime juice, and agave spirit and agave syrup, and it is it reminds me definitely of like a hibiscus agua fresca. Like it does what it says. On
Yeah.
the other hand, I sort of go, but did this need to have a non-alcoholic spirit in it to be what it is? So that
Right.
was sort of where I'm like, okay, so I like this cocktail, but I'm not sure that it needs the non-alcoholic spirit. But Irish coffee, which is a cute name for an Irish coffee where you've
Yeah.
substituted whiskey
Yeah.
for
These last
earthen.
two at least are Jim Meehan cocktails. He's got great naming skills.
Nice. So that one, I'm a big coffee fan. If you watch any of this podcast, you'll know, especially in the early days, we opened up every episode by talking about what coffee we were drinking. And coffee is sort of whenever I'm not talking about alcohol, I'm talking about coffee tends to be the thing. So I couldn't wait to try the Irish coffee. The problem with that was I actually had to go get whipped cream, so I had to make a trip to the store. Same trip that I got the hibiscus tea, actually. And I really liked how that came out. So it's just coffee and earthen substituting for whiskey, and then some simple syrup. I use simple syrup. It calls for a sugar cube, but I use simple syrup, and then topped with whipped cream. um, I felt like that turned out really, really good. Like that was definitely a cocktail that benefited from that. And to be honest, I like it better than whiskey. And that's
Oh
kind of the
wow.
refrain that I'm coming to with a lot of these spirits. These spirits are so good, I will use them even when alcohol is an option. I've said that over and over again. Like it's dry January. Phil and I and the Whiskey Lodge are done with dry week, but we're still keeping our consumption. At least I am keeping my consumption a little bit lower, unless I have a good reason, like I'm reviewing something. Um, but after dry January, I would say these spirits have a reason to be on your bar, not just because you're not drinking, not just because you're avoiding alcohol right now. They're genuinely good, and in the right spec, they function differently, and they bring something unique to your bar. So um, that there goes me waxing poetic about the products that I like again. But yeah, that's so I think that's pretty much my breakdown. I didn't really like the old fashioned recipe that was here for earthen because I feel earthen doesn't substitute for bourbon or rye particularly. But what I realized with the Irish copy is that it actually does substitute pretty well for a triple distilled light blended Irish.
Hmm.
It does a lot of the same thing. It has that sort of shininess to it, which is some people say that like it's a bad thing, like shininess is a bad tasting note. But in the right, like in when you're in the right mood or in the right cocktail, it is absolutely what you want. It's a nice light whiskey that provides that brightness to something. So, you know, it's the right thing for that cocktail recipe. I felt this one was the one where the thing on the front of the card, if I had to pick between a whiskey and ginger ale or an earthen and ginger ale, I would definitely pick the bourbon whiskey every time. So, you know, I can paper over some of my bias now by saying that, right? In certain conditions, the original cocktail recipe is going to be better, but the right cocktail recipe with these non-alcoholic spirits is really, it's worth having them for sure. It's just a matter of how often you're going to make that cocktail.
Right, and that, you know, that raises a really important question that we've had to deal with. Is like, how do we how do we figure out what cocktails to make with these? I am not a bartender. I don't pretend to be one. I mean, I do actually every night when I make myself a cocktail, and I'm competent. But we brought in some really creative bartenders to help us with these. It's very kind of like product first. Like, okay, I made this weird like artisanal botanical art spirit that was kind of constructed around these vague themes, these vague sensory themes that I wanted to bring forward, but with very little regard for substitution, like you're talking about, like tequila or whatever. How do we make cocktails with these? It may be a little, very much the cart before the horse with that. And I have just been amazed by what these do in the hands of bartenders. And it really is like, it's a dialogue. They make the spirits better because they figure out how to use them. And, honestly, I am in dialogue with bartenders and with the market right now. We're young and we're still kind of making certain refinements. I want to talk about the bitterness because that is actually there's a little bit of a production story there that I'll keep very brief. But first of all, I love hearing someone say that this non-alcoholic spirit is too strong. Like for me, that just like what else can you say that's a non-alcoholic beverage where you're just like, wow, like that's totally overwhelming. Or a non-alcoholic beverage that like kids really can't hang with. I mean, there are examples, but they're kind of few. We were fortunate to recently set up our own distillery. Instead of taking over other distilleries to carry out our production, we got our own space. We've got a tasting room, the first one in the country, and we're out in Hood River. It's this beautiful, awesome space, and I've had the privilege of designing it and setting it all up. And in that process, I had a lot of efficiency gains with extraction and was able to get more out of the botanicals, which is always important, right? In a lot of ways, with the kind of thing I'm doing, you do want to squeeze the tea bag, as opposed to if you're actually making tea. And one side effect of that was that with the aperitivo and as an illustration of this, the bitterness just more of that came through in our extraction process. So I'm now having to go back and look at this, improved extraction and formulate back out of that to get it back to where it was before. And I want to send you a bottle from a recent batch because I think that we've struck that balance, and did make some slight adjustments to it because the bitterness did get out there a little bit, and that'll also subside with time. As we know, a bottle of Fernet Branca becomes less sort of aggressive the longer it sits in bottle, and that's the case with this one too. But we are looking for roughly a Campari level of bitterness, more so than like an Amaro Alta Verde, and maybe we got a little bit in the latter direction with that particular batch.
Yeah, let me ask a silly question. I've obviously these small sample bottles. They do have something like a batch code printed on them or a date of production. Do you anticipate these things being like early batches or a particular batch being a collector's item the way that spirits can be?
Oh God, that happened at Townsend's with certain batches of the products. People would hoard batch codes, which is so funny to see. It's very flattering, but it's also a testament to, in that case, the huge reformulations I was doing from batch to batch, which I've sworn off because I really do want to create a relatively consistent product. But the flip side of having, being committed to using agricultural inputs is that those inputs are always variable, the same way they are with a distillery. With whiskey. Whiskey also has additional variables related to maturation and weather and everything else there. But I I lean into that. I accept that a certain amount of variation is inevitable. I do I have pretty rigorous evaluations of new lots of botanicals when they come in, and we'll adjust up and down according to that. But the variability is part of what makes something, I think, a craft product. Someone might disagree with me. People might believe that they have control enough that every single bottle of their product is the same. Maybe I'm just not there yet, but I hope that happens. I hope that people are engaged enough to track those slight changes, but I also hope the changes aren't so big.
Yeah. I just realized, so by the way, earlier when we got started, I said that, I was asking, is this Wilderton or Wilderton? And you said Wilderton, and that's good to know that that's the official pronunciation, because I've probably been spreading around the wrong one. I think the funny thing is that's so obvious in retrospect, and yet why did I hang on to this Wilderton pronunciation? Something about the branding made me think wild. Like the botanicals, you've got these pretty pictures of botanicals on the bottles, and other sorts of stuff like that. And something about it just made me think wild, and so I hung on to that as a pun, and like Wilderton. For what it's worth, that's a question that's going nowhere. So anyway, remind me the full name of your company.
Well, Wilderton LLC, technically.
Okay.
We often will be Wilderton Botanical Spirits.
Okay.
And that's the full name that I use, given the right amount of space, because that's what we're doing, is creating botanical spirits. And then we have another version of our word mark that has the word non-alcoholic below it, because that's important to convey to the consumer. It should be pretty front and center, but that just becomes a little bit of a mouthful. So yeah, Wilderton Botanical Spirits, Wilderton non-alcoholic botanical spirits.
Right. And of course, I've done the only rendering of that, which was not one of the things you mentioned on the title of this video. I called it Wilderton Non-Alcoholic Spirits.
That's
without
fine.
The word botanical.
That is fine.
Okay. And you are founding distiller. Do I have that correct, your title?
Yes.
So obviously distilling is all around and about these products. They say, you're the founding distiller. They say distilled somewhere on these bottles. They say, wish I could find it now. I'm pretty sure somewhere on these bottles it says distilled. And now I can't find it. So
I didn't bring one. Especially the 200s are a little bit different than the 750 ml bottles. But yes.
So let me get into the question then. So what does distillation look like when alcohol is not involved at all? Or I guess to not beg the question, is alcohol involved at any step in the process in extracting the botanicals?
Well, to your second question, I would like to round down to no, but I get the sense that we're technically minded and maybe pedantic and a little bit fastidious in this here, and I could be, I love that. So alcohol is involved, but not really in a very meaningful way. Let me just tell you how I make them. So earthen and luster are distilled almost in their entirety, meaning that the liquid that's in the bottle was in our distillery as a vapor at some point that we condensed back down to a liquid, and then we bottled basically as is. So the way that I do that is through a very old school process that you could trace back to the ancient Mesopotamians or possibly the Egyptians, which is basically a hydrosol process. Long before people started distilling alcohol, they would distill plants and create essential oils and perfumed waters that we would now call a hydrosol. So how do I do that? I use water. water is the extraction medium, and the fact that we're using water informs upstream decisions about my formulation of what goes into that, because I want to use things that really are expressed the way that I want in water. We often think of water and alcohol, water is a weak solvent, alcohol is a strong solvent. That's roughly true, but there are certain things that water is really good at, and certain things that alcohol is really good at. So we match the botanicals to the tool, of water. We brew a batch of, essentially what we would call an aqueous botanical extract. It's sort of like an herbal tea, except that it's not really designed to be consumed at that point. It's also really strong. And then we use a lauter tun for that, which is a piece of brewing apparatus. You might also see it in a whiskey distillery, to extract flavors and aromas from the botanicals. Then that vessel is fitted with a false bottom. So we will run off the extract, and then we'll load that into a still. We'll sparge it as well to try to get as much as possible out of those ingredients. And then we carry out a distillation. Our distillation will start with about 1,000 gallons of extract, and that will yield about 250 gallons of distillate. So what happens in that process, and why that process is important, is that, just think about what you have there. You've got 1,000 gallons, and that gets separated off into 250 and 750 gallons, and 750 gallons is essentially waste. We are in that process separating off all of the volatiles that we want. So everything, if it's the luster, for instance, we're going to get, lemon aromatic extractives, those from rose, those from tarragon. What we're leaving behind is, all of the cause of the turbidity, the cause of the pigmentation, the bitterness, the tannins, and we are intensifying it in that process. Distillation is sort of a process of concentration, but it's also just a process of fractionation and taking one complex mixture and picking and choosing what you want to bring over. We also use vacuum, which is important because it allows us to work with more delicate botanicals that over the course of much exposure to heat might become kind of denatured, as we would say, or distorted, or thermally affected. So using a weak vacuum helps us reduce the temperature that's required to carry out that distillation, so that we can have really clear, bright expressions of those botanicals. And again, that gets back to, what should a spirit be? And these are some of the big existential questions that I've gotten to ask throughout the process. And my answer is just my answer. It's not a dictionary definition, but something that I believe that a spirit ought to be is among the category of the strongest things you ever put in your mouth, like some of the strongest flavors, right? It should be kind of intense and overwhelming. Maybe you want to add a little bit of water to it, but we are in the U.S. We are, when it comes to spirits, mostly a cocktail drinking culture. That's the way people relate to them. And so I wanted to make something that had the intensity to really work as the base of a cocktail while using a small amount. Distillation was my way of doing that. And the aperitivo, on the other hand, is not distilled. It has distilled components, but because there's so much of it, so much of what characterizes that product and what ought to characterize an aperitivo is what we would call non-volatile. So that the types of things like gentian extractives that give it that characteristic bitterness. If you put a gentian extract through a still, you will carry over the aroma of that, but you'll leave behind the bitterness, which is part of why you use that ingredient. And so we don't put that through the still, and in keeping with the Amaro and liqueur traditions, a lot of instances of them at least don't involve distillation and are made through compounding. And so that's what we use. So we use a compounding process for that.
That makes sense, because this one actually has some sugar in it as well, listed on the nutrition facts, I got a kick out of that when I realized there were nutrition facts on these, because since they're not alcoholic beverages, they fit into the other, like the food products part of the FDA, and therefore have to carry a nutrition facts label.
And let me tell you,
I've never heard
blast.
of gentian. I've never heard of gentian before. Is it related to ginseng?
No, it's not. You've tasted gentian. Have you had Suze or Avez or Salers? Looks like Salers. Any of
I don't think
those
so.
Frenchy herbal liqueurs? Have you had Fernet Branca? Have you had Campari?
Yes. Yeah, yes, I
Yes.
have. Funny enough, the latter two I've never owned a bottle of. I am not so much, right before I became a whiskey enthusiast, I was starting in on this idea of have like building out a home cocktail bar where every time I would have my friends over, I would be going over to meet up with my friends. I'd buy a new cocktail ingredient and build a signature cocktail around that and whatever other ingredients that I had and make that the cocktail of the night and just build out my cocktail bar that way. And I got sidetracked on the spirits part, right? I was like, ooh, like whiskey I already know. Ooh, here's mezcal. That's fun. And then I just started drinking spirits neat. So I kind of got sidetracked before I anything that has a shelf life doesn't usually end up in my house because things like vermouth go bad before I can use them. And not that they go bad, right? Like I was before I realized that you're not supposed to keep vermouth for 2 years. I had a bottle of vermouth that I'd had open for 2 years. I was still using it.
It probably went a little bit of Spanish on you. Took on that rancio character of oxidation. Yeah, I
I
have
won't
the
say I
opposite
hate that.
problem. No, it's just different, right? Like it's cool
Yeah.
to see that change. I have the opposite problem where I have an entire bar full of what people would call modifiers, and I actually do drink them neat as well. But uh, like when I want to make a cocktail, I often have to go to the liquor store to get the base spirit because I never have them around. But anyway, gentian is the what I call the really the queen of bittering agents, as opposed to wormwood, for instance, which has a very sharp and pointed and kind of very location specific bitterness in the mouth. Gentian's is more rounder, more sort of general, and because of that, and because of the historical medicinal properties of it, it's been sort of the bedrock of most liqueurs that have a bitter character to them.
Okay, nice. Phil, do you have any questions?
I just
Not to
dropped
put
my
you on the
notepad.
spot.
Sorry, it's okay. I've been taking notes. I actually have a couple. Going back a little bit, because you were operating stills, do you guys have a DSP? Like a DSP number?
No, we do not. So the TTB, the Alcohol and Tobacco Tax and Trade Bureau, um, that's the monkey on your back if you are making spirits, making
Yes.
alcoholic spirits. Um, they don't really care about the fact of distillation in the abstract. They care about distillation if it might mean revenue for them. If you're moving revenue through a still, then they really want to know, or revenue opportunities. Because we don't handle alcohol, except for that asterisk that I never really clarified, we don't have a DSP.
Gotcha.
And but we get
Okay.
we get to submit to the FDA, which is gives you a new appreciation for the TTB and how straightforward compliance is over there.
Oh yeah,
Hmm.
I have a small rant about the FDA that I may share with you another time. Um, the next question, and probably a weirder non sequitur because we haven't touched on it yet. Have you considered barrel resting any of your products?
I have, and I've done just a little bit of it. I wouldn't say it was like a full faith R&D effort, but I love the idea of it. There are a couple of concerns. One is microbial
Right,
contamination.
without
One
the
theme,
alcohol content to
yeah,
kill all
exactly.
microbes it grows.
Exactly. So that changes the possibilities a lot, not having alcohol, and that goes for a lot of things. The other thing is just space. We've got a really small distillery, and we do not have maturation like built into our floor plan. I don't know where the hell we would do that, but I love the idea of doing it. I did try to kind of give a nod to maturation with the earthen. Much of what happens during maturation is the loss there are losses to evaporation, as we know, and that changes the way that the spirit kind of unfolds on the palate, such that you lose what we would call top notes, or what perfumers would call top notes. And what happens is you kind of tilt the profile more to these flavors that you experience later during the tasting experience. And as we know, there's part of that comes from extraction of vanillin and various compounds in the oak, and part of it is from losing those volatiles to the angel's share and the air of the rick house. But I did, when thinking about things that can characterize a spirit and things that often characterize a spirit, I wanted to give a real procession of flavors, and I wanted there to be a notable aftertaste. I didn't want the earthen, especially. I decided that this is the one that's not going to be really ephemeral on the palate. I want this to be serious. I want this to brood on the palate. I want it to linger. And the way that I did that was through various botanical selections that have these really heavy flavor compounds that just take a long time to evaporate. So they linger for a long time on your palate, and you're left with something. And that's why, and you can argue whether it's successful or not, the old-fashioned riff, but I wanted to make something where you could really nurse it and like think about it, notice all of these different aspects, but something that would also stick with you. And that was something that was very exciting to me. So no, I haven't done maturation. I haven't done any barrel aging, but I am thinking about maturation as something to emulate using the tools that I have.
Gotcha.
I have two follow-up questions. The first is, given that this is a distilled product that hasn't been aged in wood, where does the color in earthen come from?
The color comes from an extract of apples that is basically just apple juice that's boiled down to this dark, oxidized, heavy syrup that we can add in just tiny amounts. And the reason for that was that we got a lot of feedback from people saying, "Oh, this seems like a disconnect. It doesn't the visual experience doesn't match the tasting experience." And at first I was like, well, I want to be honest about where the color comes from, and brown should come from maturation. But then I thought about, all of the liqueurs that I've made that I've added caramel color to, just because they need to look like an Amaro. They need to match the genre conventions. And, I'm going so far out of my way trying to figure out how to get the perfect red color without using bugs or artificial dye. Why? Because an aperitivo we've just decided should be red. And so I thought, these visual cues are helpful to the consumer. We've got it right on the label, like that it contains that color. And so I thought, why not? It makes the product actually more cohesive and more understandable. And it's a botanical, another botanical ingredient. I think it made the product better when it was clear. It kind of messed with you a little bit.
Yeah, I'd love to dig in on that pedantic point, actually. As whiskey nerds, we often encounter this discussion of, is color bad for whiskey, for example? And I think a lot of people come down on color is an additive, and that takes away from the purity of the thing. But we also have a grudging respect for the industry that wants to make their product look consistent from batch to batch to batch. And kind of acknowledge that there's very little likelihood that like for most brands, the amount of color they're adding is making any significant impact on the flavor. I think that's pretty much where I come down. And it's like, I prefer, as far as whiskey goes, I'd prefer you don't color it because, I don't have an example within arm's reach, but like I've got some of my favorite whiskeys are light in color. Just think about Octomore or something like that, right? Octomore tends to be very light in color, despite how strong it is. Port Charlotte, it may be even a better example of that because I happen to like that better. So yeah, prefer you don't, like, as far as whiskey goes, prefer you don't add color because, why should you need to, right? You've got a cask. I like single cask stuff, like whatever the kind of whiskey I'm drinking, you don't need to add color. But I get why people add color, right? And especially for products like this, I get why you would add a coloring. For one thing, it has a list of ingredients and nutrition facts, right? So you're not restricted to any kind of a purity argument, I guess. You're making something that is a product of multiple things, and you've got, because of its nature, you've got preservatives and all that. I don't think there's anything wrong with any of those things. And Earthen suggests whiskey to me, right? I mean, just the way the recipes came out, kind of the way it tastes. To be honest, to me it tastes more like potpourri than like oak, right?
Okay.
That's kind of my initial right. I think in cocktails it functions like whiskey, but it's not very similar to any whiskey that I can pull off my shelf. It may be similar to whiskeys. I don't have very many Irish whiskeys, for example, and I observed earlier that I think this bears more resemblance to Irish whiskey than to Scotch, for example, or bourbon. Just an observation. Kind of forgot where I was going with this, but the color thing about this, right, aided that perception that for me this is meant to act like a whiskey, not like something else. And I don't see anything wrong with that, right? Would I have figured out that a clear spirit version of Earthen was meant to be used like a whiskey? Maybe, from the way of the recipes, but certainly the color. Every one of these things, the color did suggest to me how it would be used, right? Luster looks and smells like a vodka or a gin. Earthen looks like a whiskey. And bittersweet aperitivo, on the name alone, you know what you're expecting, but the fact that it's red, right, definitely reminds me of the thing that it seems to be replacing. So yeah, I'm totally on board. I think the colors are appropriate and did aid the experience. It gave me something to hold on to as I was exploring these for the first time.
Good. I'm glad to hear that. And there are certain the question of color in whiskey is an interesting one to me, because it's, on the one hand you could say, well, color is, adding color. I think that we can all agree that there is an extent to which most of us would agree that it's problematic, right? If you're trying to make it look like it's materially older, considerably more aged, and you're just pumping it with caramel color, like, that's one thing.
Phil is holding up a couple of anonymous bottles.
Okay.
That he would probably, let's see if we can figure out what they are from the back, that probably represent too much color.
Well, one of them is considerably older than the other, aged in a similar climate to the one that is considerably younger. And you probably have a pretty good idea of which is which. And you are probably wrong.
Yeah.
So,
well, I knew the punchline, so I figured the one
Yeah.
on the one on the left of the screen would be the
Canadian Club.
aged in the cold north. Look how dark that is. 12 years old.
Yep.
And then on the other hand,
holy cow, breaking out the big guns. 42 years old.
Wait, wow. Yeah.
But totally different colors. And
yeah,
I know for a fact that this does contain caramel color.
Yeah. Color isn't everything.
And
color tells you something, but color isn't everything for sure.
Right.
No, but you also have to, sorry.
It's one of those things that, as someone who enjoys whiskey and understands that the visual aspect of enjoying a whiskey or anything else is included in the experience, you aren't tasting it in a vacuum in that you don't see how it's presented to you. Unless you are in the dark or blindfolded, what you receive has an element of presentation to it that affects how you are going to feel about it. And having to intentionally disconnect, as a fan of spirits, intentionally disconnect the idea of this dark, rich, beautiful color from, the tasting experience is, to an extent, part of the journey of, like, learning how to appreciate a variety of spirits.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I totally agree with that. I mean, we have all these categories of senses, but the fact is they're all, like, synthesized in this messy organ that that doesn't actually differentiate among those all that much. And so it has to be learned. And I have learned to be thrilled when I see haze in a whiskey that I've diluted a little bit, but the consumer, the average, the modal consumer, let's say, for most of these products, isn't thinking in those terms. They want it to look the same. And it's interesting as a producer trying to figure out, where you concede to that and where you stick to your guns about letting variation. Letting there be variation in the way that the liquid looks or tastes um, or whatever, and you realize in some ways I tell myself I'm the least qualified person to make these decisions because I am so my head is so far let's say in my lab, and I'm so like disconnected from what the experience is like on the other end, that I'm representative of nobody.
I mean,
Uh,
certainly of your own experience.
Yes. Yes.
so earlier I mentioned 2 follow-up questions. The other follow-up question, beyond the where does the color come from, was do you have any other colored spirits, or I guess just in general, besides what's in front of us? And I believe there's you have a bitters product as well.
We don't actually, no.
Oh, okay.
You've got
Recipe
the 3 that
card.
we have.
Okay, okay. All right, so that's the full extent at the
The
moment.
recipe
Okay,
might
so
call for yeah.
there was all the bitter aromatic bitters. I guess I assumed that was one of yours, but I guess it's another brand.
Correct. Yeah, and that's a great
Which,
non-alc bitters, which is
yeah,
very, very well made. Yeah.
might have to buy some of that myself because, like I said, I've been inspired by these. I've had non-alcoholic spirits before, which were trying to be, one's trying to be whiskey, one is trying to be vodka or whatever. Um, and they come off as a pale imitation that is essentially less than in pretty much every way. And the fact that these spirits are their own thing, which work as a substitution, but they're not like you want a whiskey, but you pour earth in and you're completely satisfied. I wouldn't say that, but I would say you want a spirit and you want something in the gin direction and you pour luster. It fits the bill. Like it works, as something else, or like you make a cocktail around any one of these things, right? They serve the purposes. Um, I
I
I
will,
like I really admire that they're not trying to be a pale imitation of a real spirit. They are trying to be their own thing that is genuinely good. And as I've said again and again, I will use these even when alcohol is an option because they're that good. I like the cocktails that I've made with them. I've been inspired to work with them. I want to keep using them.
Well, thank
It
you.
gives me ammunition for the next dry week,
I will also say that perhaps somewhat unusually, I prefer 2 of the 3 of them on their own, just sipping them neat. Um, the Earthen on Ice is quite good. Um, and I have to admit that the only way I've been able to consume the bittersweet aperitivo, being someone who is not a fan of amaros and Campari and the like, has been to make a cocktail with it that does include alcohol. Basically, there's a cocktail called Old World Friends or something to that effect that is rye whiskey and an amaro. I think the original recipe calls for an Italian made amaro, but I found that it works quite well with the bittersweet aperitivo. And
Yep. And back in November, I didn't get a chance this week, even though we're out of dry week. But back in November, when it wasn't dry week, I experimented adding these to alcoholic cocktails as well. And I think that they do something unique and interesting, even when combined in alcoholic ingredients. Right? They're that versatile. Right? These are just like anything in your kitchen. Right? Think like a cook. You get an ingredient, you learn what it tastes like, and you learn what goes with it, and you build things. Right? You enjoy the making of concoctions and so on using the ingredients that you have. These are genuinely good ingredients, right? Use them in any way that occurs to you and you're going to be happy. Right? There we go,
Well, I can't that. That's that's music to my ears. I really appreciate you saying that.
I just I would be remiss if we didn't give you that feedback because, it's good feedback to give and would love to give that directly to you. I just get self-conscious when I go on that long talking about things that I like in front of the person that I'm here to interview about it. Right. Okay. I had one more question. I think we need to wrap up. Um, and I'm sorry that we're a little bit longer than we
No, no,
discussed. Hope
nope,
that's
this is
okay.
great. Absolutely.
So one more question. So you mentioned that there's an asterisk. There's some amount of alcohol, right? And there's a vacuum distillation process involved. You get a water fraction which contains. Is it zero alcohol with an asterisk at this point, or is it truly zero, like
Truly
0.0?
zero at that point. Yeah. After distillation, though, you talked at the very beginning of the show about the mouthfeel. Um, the the product after the point of distillation is, shall we say, it's a little bit sensitive, such that I'm not microbially sensitive, such that I'm not gonna take raw botanicals and put them in a tea bag and drop them into that distillate if I want to get like sweetness or heat or these things that I want to add after distillation, because they wouldn't come through if I added them before distillation. So we use very small amounts of alcohol-based extracts for those, that are literally just made by like percolating alcohol through licorice root or whatever. And so that means that there's a net ABV of about 0.03. The bittersweet aperitivo has more because I create a house citrus extract. Citrus molecules, citrus compounds are notoriously hydrophobic. They do not want to be in water. So I have this kind of trick that I use that does involve a little bit of Everclear that gets them to really be expressed in the aperitivo.
Okay. So this is not 0.000. This is like, but like less than kombucha, less than bitters, or
Yeah,
like
totally. And you also
the net contribution to a drink of alcohol from these is not
you have to think
truly
about
zero, but
correct.
it's pretty close. Okay.
I would say physiologically, most people will not experience an effect. Probably just
Okay.
about nobody would experience an effect from it. But for some people, it's important to know. There are people who, for matters of religious conviction or just their, what they have decided to do, they don't want any alcohol whatsoever. So that's why we put it right on there. Contains trace amounts of alcohol. But would I ever experience any sort of effect from it? No.
Okay. Good to know. And there was, I guess, a part B to that question. You answered a question I didn't even know I was asking, and I'm thankful for that. I was going to ask you about the what is going into the still in the first place. Is there alcohol in there, and if so, how does that come out, technically speaking, in the distillation process? So you're
No. So
taking
there's.
a water fraction,
Mm-hmm.
clearly. So
Mm-hmm.
if I guess my thought was, you've kind of already answered the question, but my thought was if there were some amount of alcohol going into the still, that would be sort of collected and set aside in the heads, and then you would take a water fraction, and then you would set aside the rest. Uh, but I think you were just about to say no. There's no
Yeah, that's
alcohol that goes into the
correct.
still.
Yeah, if we did have alcohol, then we would, we could use distillation to fraction it off and set it aside, or use it for whatever purpose. But we don't use alcohol except at that very last step. So everything that that distillation is targeting is really, in short, it's aromatics. It is aromatic compounds that are extracted in that first step of combining the water with the botanicals, and in that way, it is a type of hydrosol. So you could think of it as being prepared in a process vaguely analogous to rosewater, for instance, but just with different ends in mind.
Okay, great. I'm out of questions, and we're just about out of time. So I'll let Phil process if he's got one more question. But before that, let me just say we mentioned the Whiskey Lodge earlier. The Whiskey Lodge does a quarterly dry week, which we did the second week of January. As usual, I will put a link to the Whiskey Lodge, which is a Discord community, in the description of the video. And for anybody watching on Twitch, that should be in the chat for you now. And besides that, Seth, let us know where we can find you online, where you'd like to be interacted with.
You can add me on Instagram. I'm not super active on there, but I'm at 2_Malort. And then you can also just drop us a sorry. You could just drop
Yeah, there's a question coming, by the way.
Yeah. Drop me a line by email if you'd like, if you have any technical questions or feedback or whatever, setho@wildertonfree.com. And I would like to say for anyone listening to this, we are non-alcoholic, which means that we can just put our product in a box and ship it wherever the hell we want. So we can ship it online. I've got a coupon code. Technically, I don't usually give it out. It's not really typically my style, but like, why not? You get 20% off if you use the coupon code Seth20. So wildertonfree.com if you're interested in that. And as we saw with Doug and Phil, everyone's reaction to the different products are very different. Some people really resonate with some of them and like can't stand the others. So I'm a big believer in the 200 ml gift pack. So you can just start with these trial sizes, try out a couple cocktails, and see what strikes your fancy.
All right,
Awesome.
you answered what I was going to do, which was to prompt you to tell us where we could find your products, like a good co-host is supposed to do. And I think that covers us, actually.
Yeah. So the follow-up question, and I guess this is you mentioned Wormwood earlier, so I was kind of gonna go in that direction. I did notice that your Instagram handle was Post Malort. Malort being a very bitter wormwood-based liqueur, and anyone who's tried it will know that it's quite sharp. So what's the story behind your username there?
Can you hear me? Sorry, you were chopping out. I think it was my connection. The story behind the username is that I have just kind of endlessly cycled through really stupid puns that come into my mind. They're nonsensical. There's really no meaning in them. They're just kind of interesting ideas. Post Malort was a pun on the one hand, but also a way that I think about what I'm doing. Actually, there is actually a second meaning to it, like a double entendre of being kind of like post, like aware of these spirits, engaging with them, but kind of in this new way. It's not really a well fleshed out idea, but I've decided not to change it after having like 30 Instagram handles in the past. So here we are.
Nice. Well, okay. I think that about wraps us up. I've got a little bit of pour of the bittersweet aperitivo left over. I don't know if you've been drinking anything with us tonight, Seth. I didn't notice.
No, I totally forgot to bring something down to the office. I've got literally nothing, but I will raise a glass from my kitchen presently.
All right, sounds good.
Thanks, guys. This
well,
has been really, really fun.
Yeah, it's been great talking to you, and thank you so much for your time and for being willing to reschedule with us. Even though we missed our first appointment. Speaking of, anybody who's watching this and didn't happen to catch the original episode that we aired, we used our original time slot to talk about the cocktails that we built and the way that we were enjoying these non-alcoholic spirits. So if you want way too much commentary from Phil and I on these spirits, go watch last week's episode. And with that, cheers. And until next time, we'll see you in the lodge.
All right. Cheers, guys. Sláinte.